The Galactic Council of Sentient Races convened in the Grand Spire of Otari Prime, a structure so vast it housed entire ecosystems within its walls. Representatives from hundreds of civilizations filled the circular chamber, their voices blending into a cacophony of hisses, growls, clicks, and synthetic tones. Today, they were united by a singular agenda: the fate of Earth. The holographic display at the center of the chamber pulsed with projections of Earth's history: wars, pollution, crime, political discord. A Zalari delegate, a serpentine being with translucent scales that shimmered under the chamber's artificial light, slithered forward. "This species is primitive," it declared, its voice a dry rasp. "They squabble over imaginary borders. They destroy their own ecosystem. They are aggressive, unpredictable, and wastefully violent. It is our duty to bring them under control." A murmur of agreement spread through the chamber. The Roll-Con emissary, a towering insectoid with razor-sharp mandibles, clicked its claws together. Their technological progress is rapid but undisciplined. Left unchecked, they may become a threat to the galactic order. The Karithi, a race of crystalline beings, vibrated in harmony to express their accord. Their autonomy serves no purpose. Enslavement is logical. The vote was unanimous. Every species present agreed. Humanity will be subjugated, its people reduced to a labor force for the greater galactic good. The fleet was dispatched. First contact. Earth's night sky burned with the descent of countless vessels, blotting out the stars. The invasion was not subtle. It was overwhelming. Entire cities found themselves under siege before dawn. The aliens' technology was far beyond anything humans could muster. Barriers that deflected bullets, ships that rained energy beams from orbit, machines that dismantled military resistance in minutes. Governments fell within days. The Galactic Council established control centers, distributing orders through translators that echoed across every continent. Humanity's new role was clear. They would mine, build, and serve. Resistance was crushed before it could form. For the first few weeks, it seemed like victory was absolute. Then something changed. The aliens began dying, not from weapons, not from an organized rebellion. They simply broke. A Zalari overseer overseeing a human factory was found curled in a corner, its shimmering scales dulled, its body trembling uncontrollably. When its comrades arrived, it shrieked at them in terror before clawing out its own eyes. A Korithi command vessel lost all communication with its crew. When a recovery team arrived, they found the crystalline beings shattered into jagged fragments, as if they had torn themselves apart. The Roll-Con soldiers stationed in major cities abandoned their posts. Reports claimed they had begun whispering to themselves, their normally rigid bodies twitching erratically. Many were found lying in the streets, unmoving, their compound eyes wide with an unnameable horror. The fleet's medical officers were baffled. There was no disease, no weaponized contagion, no biological warfare. The humans weren't fighting back, at least not in any conventional sense. But something was very, very wrong. The Galactic Council, watching from afar, dismissed the initial reports as exaggerations. But as weeks turned to months, the numbers became undeniable. Their armies were collapsing. Their soldiers, creatures bred for war, hardened by the vacuum of space and the horrors of 1,000 battlefields, were falling apart. And the humans, they were still standing. A broadcast from Earth. The first message from humanity was not one of surrender. It was a transmission sent to every occupied territory, intercepted by the Galactic Council's highest authorities. The screen flickered to life, showing a single human figure. A woman in a darkened room, illuminated only by the soft glow of the camera. She spoke in flawless galactic standard, her voice calm and devoid of emotion. "You came to break us," she said. "You thought we would bend. You thought we would fear you." She leaned forward slightly. Behind her, shadowy figures loomed, indistinct but numerous. But you didn't ask the right question. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Only something ancient and terrible. You assumed we were the ones who should be afraid. The transmission ended. By then, it was already too late. Chapter 1. The Breaking Point. The Galactic Council had ruled for thousands of years, standing unshaken as a supreme authority over the known universe. Their dominion extended across countless worlds, their fleets so vast they could blot out the skies of entire planets. They had crushed rebellions, tamed warlike species, and eradicated civilizations that defied their rule. Yet now, in the aftermath of their greatest conquest, they were afraid. The reports coming from Earth were not merely concerning. They were impossible. The Zalari Supreme Commander, HFY War, stood in the central command chamber of the flagship Eternal Dominion, his translucent scales dulled with stress. The chamber, once a place of calculated strategy, was now thick with the suffocating weight of uncertainty. His subordinates, a cadre of the galaxy's finest military tacticians, huddled around the central display, their usually confident postures tense with dread. "The casualties are accelerating," one of them hissed, its scaled fingers tapping frantically against a glowing console. "Not from combat, not from resistance. They are breaking." A hollow projection flickered to life. It showed one of the Rokon generals, a monstrous warlord whose kind had conquered entire star systems with their bare claws. His massive, chitinous form was curled into a fetal position, mandibles clicking frantically in an unintelligible rhythm. His 8 eyes, once burning with predatory confidence, were now wide and empty. "Play the audio," HFY War ordered. The room filled with a sound that sent an involuntary shudder through every being present. It wasn't words. Not exactly. It was whispering, layered upon itself 1,000 times over, speaking in no known language, and yet understood at a level deeper than consciousness. One of the Korethi strategists, whose crystalline form normally resonated in perfect harmony, suddenly let out a sharp, discordant hum, an expression of extreme distress. "Shut it off. Shut it off now." The transmission ended, but the damage was done. The air in the room felt thicker, as though something unseen had slithered into the space between them. The silence was broken only by the heavy breathing of those who could still control themselves. HFY War's tail flicked with agitation. "This is psychological warfare," he declared. "Try to impose reason upon the irrational. The humans are employing some kind of sonic disruption." No. The voice belonged to a Zalari scientist. Its usually smooth and analytical tone now brittle. "We have analyzed every affected individual. There is no technology, no toxin, no biological agent at work." "Then what is causing this?" HFY War demanded. The scientist hesitated. Then, carefully, as if the mere act of speaking aloud might bring something closer, it whispered, "Knowledge." A ripple of unease passed through the room. "They know something," the scientist continued. "Something we were never meant to see, to understand. The ruin of the Korethi. By the time the Galactic Council convened an emergency summit, one of its most ancient members had already fallen. The Korethi, crystalline beings who had existed as a unified consciousness for nearly 1,000,000 years, had collapsed in a single night. Their entire race, one spread across 500 worlds, had gone silent. A reconnaissance fleet was sent to Korea Prime, their home world. What they found was wrong. At first, everything seemed untouched. The towering crystalline spires of the capital still shimmered beneath the twin suns. The streets, meticulously arranged in sacred geometries, remained pristine, but there were no sounds, no movement. And then they saw them. The Korethi lay in the streets, in their homes, in their grand halls. Their once perfect crystalline structures had shattered. It was as though something had vibrated them apart from the inside, something that had bypassed their near-invulnerable exteriors and unmade them at the most fundamental level. Their minds, once connected in an unbreakable psychic network, had been overloaded. The last recorded transmission from Corita Prime was only a single phrase, broadcast across every frequency. They do not fear us because they have never been alone. The transmission ended with a shrill, deafening resonance, one that caused the reconnaissance team's own Coriti members to spontaneously shatter. The fleet fled the system. The Council, in all its long history, had never lost an entire species overnight. Now it had, and there was nothing left to fight. The madness spreads. Across occupied Earth, the invaders had ceased their operations. The once proud war machines stood abandoned in the streets, their pilots missing or dead. The Rokon, whose empire had crushed dozens of lesser species, were found huddled in the dark corners of their strongholds, whispering to themselves in trembling, broken voices. Some had carved strange symbols into the walls, markings that no known race had ever seen. Others had taken more extreme measures. A Zalari overseer aboard a mining colony was found standing before a mirror, staring unblinkingly at its own reflection. When its subordinates arrived, it did not acknowledge them. It simply smiled. And then, without hesitation, it drove its own claws deep into its eye sockets, tearing away the flesh as if trying to remove something unseen beneath. The remaining Zalari officers fled the colony, their minds unable to comprehend what they had witnessed. The Council sent investigators. They never returned. Meanwhile, humanity continued as it always had. It was not fighting back. It did not need to, because it knew. A final broadcast. It came unexpectedly. A signal, transmitted from Earth, hijacking every Council channel. A human woman appeared on the screen, seated in a darkened room. She was unarmed, calm, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the camera. Her eyes were too knowing. "You came to break us," she said, her voice steady. "You thought we would fear you, that we would kneel." She leaned forward, her lips curving into something that might have been amusement or pity, but you never asked the right question. The shadows behind her seemed to shift, to breathe. "You assumed we were the ones who should be afraid." She did not blink. "Run." The transmission ended, and in every corner of the occupied territories, the conquerors, what was left of them, finally understood. They had not enslaved Earth. They had awakened it. Chapter 2. The Madness Spreads. The Galactic Council had conquered thousands of worlds, bent entire civilizations to their will, and crushed any species that defied them. Their domination of the stars was absolute. And yet, in the weeks following their conquest of Earth, the Council's fleets were in free fall. The reports coming from every occupied sector were contradictory, incoherent, each more terrifying than the last. No battles had been fought. No resistance had arisen, but their forces were dying. The ruins of command. Admiral Zion Tor the Zalari, one of the finest military strategists in the universe, sat alone in his personal chambers aboard the dreadnought Endless Dominion. His posture, once upright and commanding, was hunched. His normally pristine uniform was disheveled, his silver eyes sunken. In his trembling hands, he clutched a data pad displaying the latest casualty reports. 50% of their station forces were gone. No battles, no explosions, just silence. The soldiers who remained were changing. The Rokon warriors, known for their brutal efficiency, had stopped speaking entirely. They could still move, still obey orders, but they did not respond. They stood in formation, their massive, insectoid bodies twitching, their mandibles clicking in unnatural patterns. When Zion Tor ordered an examination, the results made no sense. Their brains were rotting, not from disease, not from poison. The neural pathways that control thought, logic, identity, they were breaking down, collapsing in on themselves. The greatest minds in the fleet were helpless to stop it. And then there were the whispers. They came from every corner of the occupied planet. The humans never spoke, not to their captors, not each other. But the whispers remained, echoing in the minds of the invaders, no matter how deep into space they fled. Some of them, those with weaker wills, began muttering back, repeating phrases in an unknown language, their voices layered upon themselves, as though something else was speaking through them. Zion Tor had ordered several of these individuals to be restrained and examined. What they found was worse than death. Their mouths should not have been able to make those sounds. The abandoned cities. On the ground, the alien forces had long since stopped enforcing order. What was the point? There was no rebellion. The humans simply watched. They stood in the streets, in the fields, on the rooftops of abandoned skyscrapers, waiting. Their eyes did not hold fear, nor anger, nor defiance. They held pity. A Zalari officer had attempted to interrogate a captured human, demanding answers. The footage from his body camera was later recovered. The human had sat calmly in a darkened cell, hands resting on the table. She had smiled, and then, in perfect Zalari dialect, she had spoken. "You should not have come here." The officer had laughed, assuming a psychological tactic. The human's smile widened, and then she had said something else. Something in a language the Council's records did not recognize. A language that should not exist. The officer collapsed instantly, his body contorting, his eyes rolling back in his skull as his mouth moved in silent horror. When his comrades arrived, he was already gone, not dead, but absent. His body remained. His breathing continued. His heart still beat. But he was not there anymore. The human had only watched. And then she had begun to hum. A melody, one that every single Zalari soldier on the base suddenly recognized, despite never having heard it before. The footage ended there. The falling of the Rokan. The Rokan were the mightiest warriors in the known universe. Their empire had been built on bloodshed, their culture an unbreakable foundation of conquest and strength. And yet, in the weeks following the occupation of Earth, they had turned their weapons upon themselves. The first incidents had been dismissed as stress-induced breakdowns. But then, entire platoons began vanishing. Their barracks were found empty, the walls covered in deep gouges, marks made by their own claws. Security footage from one such outpost revealed a chilling scene. A group of Rokan warriors set in formation, their armored forms motionless. A commanding officer entered the room, barking orders. No one moved. The officer approached one of them, a towering soldier, a veteran of over 100 campaigns. Report. The soldier turned his head slowly. His mandibles parted, but the voice that came out was not his own. "They see us now." The officer took a step back. The warrior twisted his own head with a sickening crack, his body collapsing instantly. Then, one by one, the others did the same. The officer fled the room, but the security feed captured the last impossible detail. Though the warriors' bodies had fallen, their shadows remained standing, and they were watching the camera. The Galactic Council's plea. From every occupied outpost, the same message was being sent back to the Council's homeworld. Retreat, retreat, retreat. But there was nowhere left to run. The madness had already spread to the fleet. The whispers had followed them into the stars. Entire ships were found abandoned, their crews missing, their logs corrupted with unreadable text. Some ships had simply vanished from existence, as if they had never been there at all. The Council held one last emergency meeting in the depths of Otari Prime, their greatest stronghold. It was no longer a gathering of rulers and conquerors. It was a room full of survivors. And then it spoke, not through technology, not through radio waves. It spoke from within them. It did not introduce itself. It did not threaten. It showed them a vision burned directly into their minds, the true history of Earth, the thing that had lived alongside humanity, that had guided them, that had waited. The council had believed themselves to be gods among the stars. They had been wrong. They were children, children who had knocked upon a door they were never meant to open. And now something had answered. One by one, the council members collapsed, their minds shattering under the weight of what they had seen. The last one standing, a trembling Zalari delegate, managed to gasp out a single word into the emergency transmission feed. Mercy. But there was no response, because humanity had never been the one to grant it. Chapter 3. The Reckoning. The Galactic Council had ruled for millennia. They had crushed empires, rewritten histories, and enslaved species across the stars. Now they were begging, but there was no one left to hear them. Their fleets were adrift, silent, abandoned. Their armies, once unmatched in strength, had turned upon themselves or vanished without a trace. And Earth watched the fall of Otari Prime. The Council's last great fortress world was a monument to their supremacy. Its towering spires, built upon the bones of conquered civilizations, had stood untouched for over 10,000 years. Now they burned. The sky had fractured, split apart like fragile glass. Not from weapons, not from war, from something else. The last transmission from Votari Prime was a live feed from the High Chamber. The Council had convened for an emergency summit, their holographic forms flickering across the great chamber. They spoke in frantic, overlapping voices, their composure shattered. There must be a cause, some technology we have overlooked. The humans know something. We must make them tell us. No more war. No more conquest. We must leave. But it was already too late. The chamber's great doors groaned as they began to open, not outward, but inward, bending like soft metal. Beyond them, there was nothing. Not darkness. Not space. Just absence. The council members screamed as the shadows moved, flowing like liquid, swallowing the chamber whole. The last image the feed captured was the Supreme Chancellor, frozen in place, his eyes black with understanding. Then the transmission cut. Votari Prime was never seen again. Not destroyed. Not conquered. Erased. The exodus that never was. A desperate order was sent to every remaining fleet. Evacuate. Flee. Abandon the core worlds. But the ships would not move. Not because they were damaged. Not because they lacked power. But because their crews had simply stopped. When investigators were sent aboard, they found thousands of soldiers standing at their stations, their eyes open but empty, breathing, heartbeat steady, but gone. One officer, upon approaching a motionless Solari pilot, heard a sound so faint it barely existed. A whisper. The pilot's lips did not move, but still the whisper came. "It's awake." The officer ran. He never made it off the ship. The fleet remained motionless, a graveyard of Titanic warships filled with the living dead. A message from Earth. At the center of the chaos, a single transmission echoed across every frequency in the known universe. It did not originate from any known human city. It did not come from any known system. It simply was. A face appeared on the screens. A human woman. The same woman the council had seen before. She was seated in the same darkened room, her expression unchanged. But now there was something behind her, something that should not be there. It was not watching. It had never needed to. She spoke. "You were warned." Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "You came here thinking you were gods." She tilted her head. "But gods do not tremble. Gods do not run. The shadows behind her moved, stretched, filling the screen. You ask why we do not fear you. She smiled. You should have asked why we never looked up at the stars. The transmission ended, and then, across every world the Council had ever ruled, the lights went out. The silent aftermath. There was no war, no bloodshed, no great battle to mark the fall of the Galactic Council. One day, they simply ceased to be. Their fleets drifted, their cities lay empty. Their names became whispers in the dark corners of the universe, warnings to those who might come after. And Earth, it remained, untouched, unchallenged, waiting, because something else had always been there, something older than the Council, older than the stars themselves. It had never needed to protect humanity. It had only been patient. Now, there was nothing left to wait for, and for the first time in history, the universe finally understood. Humanity had never been alone, and it never would be. The end.